Some people only feel emotionally secure when you stop feeling emotionally secure yourself. At first, their behavior does not look dangerous. They seem caring, emotionally invested, protective, maybe even deeply attached to you, but slowly, something begins changing inside you. You become more uncertain around them, less emotionally grounded, less connected to your own instincts naturally. And the strangest part? You often blame yourself first. You think, maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I became insecure on my own. But emotional weakness rarely appears suddenly. Usually, someone helped create it slowly. Another important realization begins forming when you notice how differently some people react the moment you become emotionally stronger, more independent, more confident, more emotionally calm. Instead of feeling happy for you, they become colder, more distant, more emotionally reactive. And that reaction reveals something important psychologically, because emotionally healthy people do not feel threatened by your emotional stability. Another subtle shift begins happening when emotional support starts becoming inconsistent. One moment, they encourage you, support your goals, validate your emotions, and the next, they criticize your decisions, question your confidence, reduce your certainty indirectly, not aggressively, quietly. And quiet emotional reduction changes people more deeply than obvious cruelty, because repeated doubt slowly weakens self-trust. Another meaningful realization begins appearing when you notice how emotionally controlling people often prefer the version of you that feels emotionally unsure, the version that constantly seeks reassurance, the version that apologizes too much, the version that over-explains feelings before speaking. Because emotionally uncertain people become easier to emotionally influence. Another important pattern begins forming when emotional exhaustion starts replacing emotional peace. You replay conversations afterward, analyze reactions carefully, question whether your emotions were valid, not because you became unstable naturally, because repeated emotional pressure weakened inner certainty gradually, and weakened certainty creates emotional dependence. Another powerful shift begins happening when your nervous system starts adapting to emotional unpredictability. You monitor tone more carefully, watch emotional reactions constantly, prepare yourself mentally before difficult conversations, not consciously, automatically, because your body learned that emotional tension may appear unexpectedly, and emotional unpredictability creates anxiety faster than people realize. Another subtle realization begins forming when your emotional needs slowly start shrinking, not disappearing, shrinking. You express less frustration, less disappointment, less honesty, not because your feelings changed, because emotional expression started feeling emotionally expensive, and emotionally exhausting environments slowly reduce authenticity. Another meaningful shift begins appearing when emotional weakness starts becoming emotionally useful for the other person. Because the more emotionally uncertain you become, the more reassurance you seek, the more approval matters, the more emotionally dependent you become on their reactions. And emotional dependence increases influence naturally. Another important realization begins happening when you notice how some people become calmer the moment you lose confidence in yourself, the moment you stop questioning them and start questioning yourself instead. Because emotionally controlling people often feel safest when your emotional world becomes unstable. Another powerful pattern begins forming when guilt begins appearing. Every time emotional independence appears, you set boundaries. They become hurt. You take emotional space. They become distant. You stop over-explaining yourself. They react emotionally. And eventually, your brain begins associating emotional strength with emotional consequence. That changes behavior deeply, because over time you stop asking, "What feels healthy for me?" and start asking, "How will they react?" Another subtle shift begins happening. When emotional caution starts replacing emotional freedom, you think carefully before speaking, carefully before disagreeing, carefully before expressing emotion honestly. Not because communication became healthier, because emotional reactions became psychologically exhausting, and exhaustion changes personality quietly. Another meaningful realization begins appearing when emotionally healthy people begin feeling completely different. Healthy people do not punish emotional independence. Do not reduce your confidence to feel powerful. Do not make emotional honesty feel dangerous. Instead, you feel calmer around them, more emotionally safe, more connected to yourself naturally, and emotional safety expands identity, while emotional control slowly shrinks it. Another important realization begins forming when you stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional connection, because intensity is not always love, attachment is not always emotional safety, and emotional dependence is not intimacy. Sometimes it is simply fear of losing approval, fear of emotional withdrawal, fear of becoming emotionally alone again. Another powerful shift begins happening when you finally reconnect with your emotional strength again. You stop apologizing for harmless emotions. Stop shrinking yourself to avoid reaction. Stop abandoning your instincts to maintain temporary peace. And slowly, your emotional ground begins returning, not dramatically, steadily. Because emotionally strong people are not people who never feel pain. They are people who stop abandoning themselves emotionally. Another subtle realization begins forming when you recognize how much of your personality slowly disappeared while trying to keep emotional peace. You became quieter, more emotionally restrained, more cautious around simple conversations, not because that was your true personality, because your nervous system adapted to emotional pressure. And adaptation changes people quietly, until one day, they no longer sound like themselves anymore. Another meaningful shift begins appearing when your emotional clarity finally becomes stronger than your fear of reaction. You stop over-monitoring emotional atmosphere constantly. Stop needing reassurance before trusting your instincts. Stop sacrificing emotional truth to avoid emotional discomfort. And awareness changes emotional dynamics more than people realize, because emotionally controlling behavior loses power the moment self-trust returns. Another important realization begins happening when you finally understand that some people truly do need you emotionally weak, because your emotional weakness makes them feel emotionally powerful. But emotionally healthy people do not need your insecurity to feel secure themselves. They do not need your confusion to feel important. They do not need your self-doubt to feel emotionally strong. And once you fully recognize that difference, your standards begin changing completely. Another powerful realization begins forming when you stop believing that emotional suffering is proof of emotional depth, because real emotional safety feels different. It feels calm, clear, stable, safe, not emotionally exhausting, not psychologically draining, not built on fear of reaction. And once emotional safety becomes familiar again, something important begins returning too. Your confidence, your emotional clarity, your inner voice, not instantly, gradually, quietly, but powerfully, until one day, you stop feeling emotionally small around people who once controlled your emotions. You stop questioning your instincts automatically. You stop abandoning yourself to maintain someone else's emotional comfort, and your emotional strength finally begins feeling like your own again. Another subtle realization begins forming when you notice how emotionally controlling people often become uncomfortable. The moment you stop needing their approval, the moment you stop chasing reassurance, stop over-explaining yourself, stop emotionally reacting the way you used to. Because emotional control weakens when emotional dependence weakens too. Another meaningful shift begins appearing when peace finally stops feeling emotionally suspicious. You stop waiting for tension constantly. Stop preparing for emotional reactions before they happen. Stop monitoring every small change in mood. And slowly, your nervous system begins relaxing again. Not because life became perfect, because emotional survival mode finally started fading. Another important realization begins happening when you understand that emotionally healthy love does not require you to become smaller for someone else to feel bigger. It does not require fear, confusion, self-doubt, or emotional exhaustion. Real emotional safety feels different. It allows you to stay connected to yourself, to your voice, to your instincts, to your emotional strength. And once you experience that kind of emotional safety again, you stop romanticizing emotional suffering completely. Because emotionally healthy people do not need you emotionally weak to love you. Another disturbing realization begins forming when confusion starts affecting your emotional identity itself. Not only your decisions, your identity. You stop knowing what you truly feel, what you truly want, what reactions genuinely belong to you. Because repeated emotional contradiction creates internal disconnection, and disconnected people become emotionally easier to influence. Another subtle shift begins happening when emotional clarity starts feeling almost dangerous. You want to trust yourself, but immediately question your own judgment afterward. You want to express boundaries, but guilt appears instantly. You want to speak honestly, but anxiety interrupts the reaction, not because honesty is wrong, because confusion trained your nervous system to fear emotional certainty. Another meaningful realization begins appearing when you notice how emotionally confusing people rarely give complete emotional stability. Only partial stability. Enough warmth to create attachment. Enough inconsistency to create insecurity. Enough reassurance to prevent leaving. Enough uncertainty to maintain emotional dependence. An unstable reassurance creates powerful psychological attachment because the brain becomes addicted to temporary emotional relief. Another important shift begins forming when emotional confusion begins changing your self-image quietly. You stop seeing yourself clearly. Your strengths feel smaller. Your instincts feel weaker. Your emotional reactions feel unreliable. And over time, you begin relying more heavily on other people's interpretation of reality than your own perception. That is one of the deepest effects of psychological confusion. It disconnects people from internal authority. Another powerful realization begins happening when you understand that confusion often grows through small emotional moments, tiny contradictions, tiny dismissals, tiny reactions, tiny emotional punishments, not dramatic enough to clearly identify, but repeated often enough to slowly reshape emotional confidence. And repetition changes the brain more powerfully than intensity. Another subtle pattern begins appearing when emotional relief becomes more powerful than emotional truth. You stop asking, "Is this healthy?" and start asking, "How do I keep the tension away?" Because once emotional confusion becomes chronic, peace feels emotionally addictive. Even temporary peace, even unhealthy peace, and emotional exhaustion increases compliance naturally. Another meaningful shift begins forming when your nervous system begins associating disagreement with emotional danger. You hesitate before honesty, before independence, before emotional expression. Not because disagreement is unsafe, because previous reactions created emotional instability, and unstable emotional environments train caution deeply. Another important realization begins appearing when you notice how emotionally healthy environments affect your body differently. You breathe easier, think more clearly, speak more naturally, not because those environments are perfect, because emotional safety reduces psychological tension, and reduced tension restores mental clarity. Another powerful shift begins happening when you stop interpreting confusion as proof that someone is emotionally deep. Because confusion is not depth, emotional unpredictability is not mystery, and psychological instability is not passion. Sometimes, confusion simply means your nervous system is struggling to feel emotionally safe. That realization changes perception completely. Another subtle realization begins forming when emotional certainty slowly starts returning. You stop second-guessing every reaction. Stop analyzing every conversation repeatedly. Stop searching for hidden meaning inside every emotional interaction. Not because life became simpler, because emotional fog stopped controlling your mind constantly. Another meaningful shift begins appearing when self-trust becomes stronger than emotional pressure. You begin listening inwardly again, trusting discomfort, trusting intuition, trusting emotional clarity, not perfectly but consistently. And consistency rebuilds psychological stability. Another important realization begins happening when you understand that emotionally confusing environments often reduce confidence indirectly, not through direct humiliation, through destabilization, the slow destabilization of perception, memory, emotion, self-trust, and destabilized people become emotionally easier to guide. Another powerful pattern begins forming when you recognize how much energy confusion steals from your life. Energy once used for creativity becomes overthinking. Energy once used for confidence becomes emotional monitoring. Energy once used for joy becomes psychological survival. And emotional survival mode changes personality quietly. Another subtle shift begins appearing when you stop normalizing emotional confusion as love. Because love should not constantly disconnect you from yourself. Love should not make your mind feel unstable. Love should not create endless emotional uncertainty. Healthy emotional connection creates grounding, not constant psychological fog. Another meaningful realization begins forming when you remember who you were before confusion became constant, before hesitation replaced confidence, before self-doubt interrupted every instinct, before emotional exhaustion became normal. And that memory matters because it reminds you that your clarity was never fully destroyed, only buried beneath repeated uncertainty. Another powerful realization begins appearing when you understand that control becomes strongest when people stop trusting themselves. Because once inner certainty weakens, outside influence grows stronger automatically. That is why clarity protects identity. protects boundaries, protects emotional independence. Another important shift begins happening when emotional calm begins returning naturally to your nervous system. You stop preparing emotionally for every conversation. Stop fearing disagreement automatically. Stop shrinking yourself emotionally to prevent instability. And slowly, your thoughts begin feeling safer again. Another subtle realization begins forming when you recognize that your confusion was never proof of weakness. It was proof that your nervous system was adapting to repeated emotional inconsistency. And adaptation can be unlearned. Gradually, patiently, consistently, through emotional safety, through self-trust, through stable environments that allow clarity to exist again. Another meaningful shift begins appearing when you stop abandoning your perception every time someone challenges it emotionally. You stop immediately assuming, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm too sensitive, maybe I misunderstood, and instead, you begin observing behavior more clearly, patterns more clearly, emotional dynamics more clearly. Because awareness interrupts manipulation quietly. Another powerful realization begins forming when you finally understand that mentally clear people become harder to control, harder to pressure emotionally, harder to destabilize psychologically, harder to manipulate through fear, confusion, or emotional unpredictability. Because clarity creates emotional ground, and emotional ground creates independence. Another important shift begins happening when your inner voice starts becoming louder again than emotional pressure around you. You stop needing constant reassurance, stop needing permission to trust your own feelings, stop treating your instincts as emotional enemies. And slowly, your mind begins feeling emotionally safe again. Not because the world changed, because your connection to yourself returned. And once self-connection returns, confusion loses power naturally, quietly, gradually, until one day, your thoughts no longer feel emotionally trapped. Your emotions no longer feel controlled by uncertainty, and your clarity finally feels like your own again.